Welcome to Keeping It Young podcast, conversations about marriage, family, and ministry life. I'm Dave.
And I'm Bethlie.
And we're the Youngs.
We're glad you've joined us today.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's podcast episode. Last 2 weeks, we've been just talking about practical advice for training our children.
Yes.
And one of the, I guess, maybe the number one question, comment, thought we get on the road and in our meetings and in our conferences has to do with training children. Would you agree with that?
Right. There are a lot of questions about that.
And we talk a lot about marriage and other things as well, but this is just a big one because the culture we live in seems like we get so little help about training our children. So
True.
I know a lot of families are very concerned about their children.
Right.
So this is kind of what this kind of, was born out of, a few questions and conversations we've had in recent weeks. And if you were with us 2 weeks ago, we talked about the pitfalls to avoid and just kind of covered that.
Right.
And then last week we discussed some questions to consider in training our children. And today we want to talk about a little bit about some must-have goals in training our children. Just every parent, no matter what age your kids are,
Right.
here's some goals that every parent ought to have. And we've tried to simplify this one down just to keep it real simple, easy to digest, and easy to use today.
Right. And I don't want to say that these are general things because it's really not general. Maybe the whole series is kind of generalized because there can be specific questions about training children, and maybe we won't get to a specific thing, but we've introduced it and we've talked about reasons that parents don't train their children or maybe are shy away from training their children because of cultural philosophy or whatever. And so then today we're going to talk about some things that maybe you should consider.
Absolutely.
that your child should know how to do.
Let's jump into these. These are must-have goals in training our children.
Right.
And we've kind of thrown 4 out here. We're going to give you 4, and they're fairly simple, but let's
Right.
talk about them. The first one is simply this: respond when addressed. Now, this is a huge one in our culture.
Yes, it is.
One of the things about our culture is that we have headphones,
True.
and it's almost impossible. It's actually fairly normal today to speak to someone and they not at all acknowledge that you spoke.
True.
And sometimes it's just because the culture we're living in is just kind of like, why are you talking to me? I do not know you.
Yeah.
Or I'm not interested in having conversation. Please leave me alone.
Right.
And we have this new idea, about the introvert extrovert thing. Is well,
Right.
I'm an introvert, so I should not have to speak back to you.
Yes.
There's a ton of ideas that go into it. But one of the things Bethlie and I firmly believe is that our children should respond when addressed.
Right.
And especially in 4 areas. I could think probably of others, but we want to give you 4.
Right.
Our children should respond when corrected.
Yes.
So that if you speak to your child and there's absolutely no acknowledgement that you gave an order, that you asked them not to do something, that you called their name, well, then it indicates that you got work to do.
Absolutely.
Because our goal should be able to say to our child, no, and it get a reaction, a response.
Well, and that does have to be trained into them, because if you have let your toddler, you try to get your toddler's attention and you let them, for instance, run away from you, or you let them go ahead and keep playing when you're trying to talk to them instead of getting their attention, then they'll get to be 4 and 5 and 7 and 10 and still feel like, well, if mom's talking, I can just ignore her until she gets really, really upset. And then when I hear the really, really upset tone, then I will respond and say, oh yeah, I hear you. So the best way is really to start when they're tiny and to get right down where they can see you and you're looking eyeball to eyeball and saying, hey, I was talking to you. This is what mommy wants you to do.
Yeah, or dad. And think about this. One of the things you can observe if you just maybe sit in an airport and watch families with children, it is normal in our society and in our culture for parents to say things to their children and they either get a response of, kind of a shrug it off or a withdrawal or even a little bit of haughtiness.
Right.
And sometimes parents then kind of ignore that and roll their eyes at their child, and then they try again later.
Right.
And we've seen this. How many times have we seen this to where it eventually escalates to where somebody is finally, I've had it, you will do what I told you to do.
Right.
But by the time it escalates, the child has also escalated, and everybody is, at that point tense. That is not parenting. That's frustrating.
Right.
That's irritating. That's annoying to everybody involved.
Right.
The parent, the child, those who are observing.
Right.
And the people who have to be around you on an airplane or in a store or at a table or at a restaurant.
Right.
And so this is just a huge goal. If your child is a teenager and you speak to your teenager, you should expect that they respond when corrected.
Yes.
Now, that's a big one. So you have to teach that. If they're little, you have to mean it. If you say no, mean it.
Yes.
And a couple of times of correcting. A couple of times of addressing that you didn't respond, whether that would be a reminder over a process of time, or if necessary, a spanking over a process of time. That eventually leads to a child responding when corrected, and that's a wonderful thing.
Yes, and it is something you can decide as a parent. You and your husband sit down and have the talk about, are we going to have them say yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and all of that. That may not matter to you, but at least your child should look at you when you say, hey, please don't do that. They should respond in some way by saying yes, or at least acknowledging, looking in your face and nodding their head. I did hear you, and I am going to follow through with what you said.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where we got everything we did when our kids were smaller, but one of the things I'm grateful for is that we had people in our lives who mentored us and pointed us in the direction of how to simplify parenting down to the point of just simply saying to our kid, to any one of our five, just no, sir.
Right.
And the response was an immediate stop what they were doing and acknowledge that we spoke and then walk away.
Right.
And if you have to forcefully move your child from a negative situation rather than they're responding to your voice, then you really do have more parenting to do, because it's our goal to respond. Our children should respond when addressed.
Yes.
And certainly when they're corrected. That's a pretty big one. Anything else you would add to that one? Maybe some practical suggestion about any step up mom ought to take?
Well, you can remind them. I know just a few moments before we started to record, I had asked Charity something, and she responded with a short answer, but I wanted to hear yes, ma'am. And so I just said, hey, yes, ma'am. And she said, oh, yes, ma'am. So you can remind your teenager if that's what you're looking for, but you do want to hear some sort of response from them, especially if they're in another room, or you want them at least to acknowledge, yes, I did hear you, and yes, I am about to do what you asked me to do.
Sure. And one of the things, find out what works for you. Cultures vary, of course, across, even nations and different cities or different parts of the country. But we wanted our children, if I said to one of my, children, if I said Matthew, I wanted yes, sir. Or if mom said Matthew, what we wanted was yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Our neighbors, I know when they speak to their children, they will say ma'am.
Right.
Or sir.
Yes.
And so it's, there's cultures can vary on that, but it's always a good thing for your child to acknowledge a correction when you're speaking to them, that they respond in yes or I will do that.
Yes.
A verbal response and then a follow through obedient response is just very important.
Right. Yes.
So respond when addressed, that's true during correction, and it's also true respond when greeted.
Yes.
And this is just huge in the culture like ours. Moms and dads, one of the things that will set your child apart is if someone speaks to your child and says hello or how are you. If your child shows respect to that person by responding to a greeting. And sometimes our culture is so, maybe overly fearful. It is a wicked, evil, godless, just a very, very filthy culture. But it's also good at the same time. Most of you that would listen to us would take your children to church. If an older person says to your child, hello, and they totally ignore the person, then mom and dad, I'm not trying to be mean about this. It just means you've got training yet to do.
Yes.
Because it is the right thing to do for your child to have polite respect, especially for authority. And we even taught our children when, an older person came by to speak to them, stand up. And, there was not we didn't make a huge deal about it. I don't know that anybody ever got in trouble for it, but it didn't take too much reminding and also modeling.
Right.
When an older person would come by and I would stand up and then motion for the children to stand up with me.
Right.
What I was teaching them to do was respond when addressed.
Yes.
And that's so true when greeted. Teenagers, especially sometimes in our culture, have to work on that.
We actually took a family day just last week, or was it this? Yeah, this past week.
Yeah, it's been a crazy last few days.
It has been
just
crazy.
A few days ago.
We took a family day, and Charity loves to do some antique shopping. Not David's cup of tea, so he went and or cup of coffee, as David would say.
And I can drink tea too if I have to.
So he had gone to the truck, I think, to do some reading and maybe some phone calls. And so I was walking with Charity
Actually,
through.
some sleeping.
Oh, you were napping. Oh, that's nice too. I was walking through Charity through this antique mall, and right before we left, I went to visit the restroom. And when I came out, Charity was sitting next to an older lady, and they were just having a big old conversation. So I just went over and I said hello, and the older lady said, "I just need to compliment you on your girl here." And I said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "She just sat down here and just started talking to me, and she's been answering my questions." And she said, "I can't believe that she's a teenager who would actually talk to me." She said, "Even my own grandkids, I can't get more than one word answers out of them when I talk to them because they're stuck to their phones or they have their earbuds in or whatever." And she said, this was awesome just to sit down and have a polite conversation with a teenager. And it does make a difference, parents. It really does. I know you probably would not leave your 5-year-old outside of the ladies' room to have a conversation. No, you should not. But Charity was perfectly safe. It was a safe environment.
And she's a teenager.
And she is a teenager, and she had a conversation. So parents, there is nothing wrong with, I know I have heard young parents say these days, they're like, "I'm not going to make my kids talk to strangers. I'm just not going to make them do that." Well, I understand that. They don't want to have a big, long conversation, your 4-year-old with, somebody they don't know at the grocery store. But if it's an older couple in your church or another gentlemen in your church that you have seen go to church and that they are faithful and that they're trying to walk with God, what an opportunity to teach your child to be respectful, to just have common courtesy. And so it's okay for them when they are addressed to say, "Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am." It doesn't mean they have to stop and have a conversation, but they can at least respond when talked to.
Yeah, and when if you have a little one and someone speaks to your little one and they don't respond back, but you're training and you say hello, and your child is defiant. They pull back. They throw their head around the other way. They get very, very defiant about it. Then that's a whole other ballgame, because that's a matter now of training obedience.
Right.
And so moms and dads, our goal is that our children grow up to be polite and respectful. And part of that is teaching them to respond when they are greeted.
Right. And you might say, "Well, my child is really shy." And we have all of this now, everyone is labeling themselves. I'm an introvert, I'm an extrovert, I'm an intro extrovert, or whatever. And I understand that. Personality differences are a real thing, but it doesn't matter if you're an introvert. You still need to have common courtesy. There is no call to be rude.
Absolutely.
And so Christians, above all people, should be people who can greet people when greeted.
And we actually teach our children to, when they, we do a lot of church work, and so we're around new people all the time. So we would teach our children to smile at people,
right,
and speak first.
Yes.
And then we would add to that: smile, speak first, ask questions. Those were our 3 things that we said to our children: smile, speak first, ask questions. And we're talking about teenagers right there. But start really early.
Yes.
It's always a good thing to teach your child to be pleasant when they smile at someone.
Right.
Or if someone says hello and they respond, then you're on the right track.
Yes.
Our goal here, number 1, is to respond when addressed. That's when corrected, when greeted. We wrote down 2 others here. I guess we've kind of already touched on number 3 there, haven't we? When ordered.
Right. When given a direction.
When given a direct order, you want your child to respond to that.
Right.
And that may be a matter of just saying, "Yes, sir," and you find what you expect from your child. We had friends in Tennessee, and their child did kind of was it "yeah, ma'am"?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yeah, ma'am. And
Yes.
so we would insist on our kids saying yes, but they would let their kids say, "Yeah, ma'am." And there's nothing wrong with that. It wasn't that we were right and they were wrong, but
Right.
both of us were teaching our children to respond when
At
addressed.
least there was a response.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And the last one is a big one. Respond when addressed. We would say one more thing about this one. Respond when loved. And this almost should be a given, and why it's not in our culture is just beyond me. If you say to your teenage son, "Hey son, I love you,"
right.
it is a mark of their maturity and respect and adulthood when they respond in kind. So teach your child that if you say "I love you," that their response should be "I love you too." and that it's just always normal. If grandma says, I love you, you respond with, I love you.
Right.
If grandpa says, I love you, or if grandpa says, you're beautiful, say, thank you, grandpa. You're the best.
Right.
And so just respond when addressed. That's our first goal we want to talk to you
and
about.
we're not being weird about that. We're talking about within the family,
Sure.
loving and affectionate terms like that. But as David just said, if someone compliments you, your child should learn to say thank you.
Yep. And that's just somebody showing that they, are kind, or if someone's being kind. And I guess we could put all that under love. And most of the time when we are speaking to you that are listening, a lot of you are church, in fact, maybe all of you are church people. And the church is a family.
Yes.
And so your children should show grace to each other. I just love it. And I'm always so impressed when I speak to a teenage young man and he stops, looks me in the eyes,
Right.
and responds and answers questions and has a discussion with me. And what that says is someone is being well trained.
Someone is being well trained, and someone is maturing. It does teach your children maturity
Absolutely.
if you teach them these things.
Okay, so the number one goal was respond when addressed. Okay, what's number two?
Yes, obey well.
We've hammered this one in other
Yes,
podcasts.
we've talked a lot about
but
this.
not all of you have heard all of our podcasts, and we need to review this one all the time because our children must learn obedience.
Yes.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right, is God's command. In fact, it
Yes.
is the command in the Bible to honor moms and dads, and it is a command that has a promise with it. And God promises there is a blessing from God, that there is favor from God when our children learn to obey and honor well.
Yes.
And that's so important. That should be one of our goals. And by that, when we talk about obedience, Bethlie and I always meant by that, we wanted our children to obey the first time we spoke.
Right.
We don't want to raise our voice. We don't want to have to yell. We don't want to have to count.
Right.
We don't want to have to come down on you like a ton of bricks. We simply want to speak, and you absolutely right away respond. You do it first.
Right.
You do it immediately. So our word was fast. So right away and fast. And then our word was happy. And we
Right.
said that in two ways. The goal is to have a happy heart.
Yes.
But if your heart's not quite there yet, get your face there, because when your face gets there, it affects your heart.
Yes.
And so obeying well is a huge one. Just
really is.
learning to obey well. And
And
that's our goal as parents, to train that.
It starts in the home. And I know that there are parents who are like, well, I just want them to be able to be their own person. I don't want to have to order them around all the time. But it teaches maturity. It really does teach maturity when you train your child to be able to follow directions. And as they mature, they are going to come to a place where they're going to have to follow directions from someone.
That is so
whether
true.
that be an educator, whether that be a boss somewhere, they just are going to have to follow directions. Whether that be a police officer, they're going to have to learn to obey. And so why not learn it young and in the home?
Yeah, and before a child can evidence a godly personality, a righteous response, they
Right.
have to be well trained.
Yes.
So moms and dads, if you're just leaving them to, well, let's just see how their personality, that's just their personality, and you're not training them, what you're doing is you're setting them up for failure in life and for major struggles in life.
Absolutely.
And the culture we're living in is proving that up one side, down the other. The culture we're
Yes.
living in is, illustrating for us what children left to themselves will do. They will go the wrong direction. They will struggle with self-control, with self-denial.
Right.
They will struggle with self-sacrifice. They become very me-oriented.
Yes.
And how many times in marriages do we see couples who have never been trained to respond well, to have self-control and self-denial, and the fallout is just enormously negative.
It is.
And so moms and dads, you got to help with this one. This is a huge must-have goal in training our children.
Yes.
They have to respond when addressed and obey well.
Yes.
What else would we say about obeying well?
Well, I would say it also teaches them to listen to the voice of God and to learn how to submit and obey Him.
Absolutely.
And if you are a child who has been trained to obey, then you are already in the habit, can I say, of listening for your parents' voice and hearing what they have to say, and then following through with that and responding with a submissive attitude and a happy heart. And then that can translate into their spiritual life. And so they can listen to the voice of God. And even when He does ask things of them that they're like, I really don't want to do that. Well, my mom and dad taught me how to obey happily. And Lord, I'm going to do this. I am going to obey you happily and submit.
Yeah, and as our children learn to obey, even when they don't want to, what they find out is that obedience is better than disobedience.
Yes.
And sometimes a child doesn't understand what is in the heart of a parent when a parent says, you may not do that.
Right.
But if they obey, there comes an understanding.
Yes.
And oftentimes we wait for our children, well, when they understand, then I can teach them. Not if they're
No.
young. If they are
No.
young, you have to teach them to obey, because with their obedience, their self-denial, they're developing self-control,
Yes.
their self-sacrifice. With the giving up of themselves to your leadership, they are learning how to live a happier life.
Yes.
They will then understand. So
Yes.
obedience has to be taught to our younger children in order for them to understand properly how to evaluate things in life that make sense.
Yes. And that even that spills over into our spiritual life too. How many times do we go through things and we do not understand what the Lord is doing? We just think, goodness, Lord, this just doesn't seem like it's making any sense at all. Why would this happen in our life? But after you go through that season and you see how he brought you through, and you see the things that you learned, or maybe the people you were able to influence that, and then you have more of an understanding. You're like, oh, Lord, I get this. Thank you
Sure.
so much for what you've done in our life. And that is the same thing with your children. Obedience, them learning obedience, they're not going to understand when they're 18 months old or 2 years old why you don't want them to touch that stove. But it is important that they do not touch that stove. They're not going to
Absolutely.
understand that. But teaching them the obedience of, Mama said no. Mama said no. And then you reinforce that no, then it saves them a lot of heartache.
It does, and it brings understanding to their life.
Yes. And then when they're 5 years old, they're like, yeah, I don't want to touch that stove. It's hot.
Yes, and they have to learn the obedience in order to process that correctly.
Yes.
So that's so important.
It is.
And, even in the book by Charles Spurgeon entitled Come Ye Children, one of the things he does is he talks about how that when we train our children well, and then we train them in the gospel truths, Charles Spurgeon said, any child properly trained and properly taught can easily be saved by the age of 5. And that astonishes some of our friends who are convinced that, that's way too young for a child to
Right.
understand
They don't
how to be saved.
understand. Right.
But what they understand is the truths. They can process. They're already starting to process God's truth and
Yes.
God's voice in their own heart
Yes.
and their own thinking. And then they're able to respond to that with understanding. It's
Right.
amazing how fast it does work. But moms and dads, if you have little ones, you got to really work hard at that one.
Yes.
You want them to respond when addressed. You want them to obey well. Those two go together, and they are massive.
Yes, they are.
Massively important. Do we have time to close these out?
I think so.
Okay, let's do the next one. What's our next goal you must have in training your children?
Manners.
We
Teaching
want
them manners.
Oh yes, to use manners.
Yes.
And that just seems so old fashioned in our day. And by that we mean, like at meals,
Yes.
and how you treat others and showing kindness. All
Right.
those are a matter of manners.
Yes.
And it's a matter of training. One of the reasons parents should always eat together at a table.
Yes. Eat with the family.
Families. One of the
Yes.
reasons families should always eat together at a table as often as possible. It's a wonderful place to model proper manners,
Yes.
proper behavior, and to
Right.
teach proper manners and proper behavior.
Yes.
It's a place to talk and listen. It's a place to enjoy being with each other. But what a time to say, this is how you hold your fork.
Right.
Slow down. It's proper to take smaller bites so you can talk.
Yes.
And it's just a matter of showing how to do things.
Right.
And it makes meal times and family times phenomenally blessed and wonderful.
Right. And it's not that you don't have fun. From previous episodes that we have a lot of fun when we sit at the table with our children. And sometimes things did get out of hand and get crazy. But the norm of sitting at a table is, we're going to pass the food this way. And you're going to say please and thank you when you ask for something. And if you want to be dismissed from the table, excused from the table, you're going to ask to be excused. And you're going to say thank you for the meal. All of this was trained and modeled at the table so that our older children are without excuse. Can I say
Are you
They have
listening,
been
older
trained.
children?
No, they all do really well.
Yes, they do.
They know how to have
Sure.
fun at a table. They know how to have good conversation, and they also know how to behave at a table.
Yeah, and I would always stand when Bethlie comes to the table. I would try to seat her, get her chair for her, and I would make my boys stand with me.
Right.
And as the kids became teenagers, Noah, it became a little bit of a fun, joking time. The boys would sometimes salute their mom and do all kinds of different things. So it was kind of a little bit of a funny time, but it was also
Right.
a way of showing respect, a way
Yes.
of showing manners. And that's not just something you can do at meals, but it's how you treat others.
Yes.
It is very mannerly to show respect to others, to let an older person go first, or to help
Right.
a person who needs help, or to show concern for someone who's hurt. Those are a matter of just using manners and showing kindness to others. It's just a
Right.
kind thing to reach out to someone.
Absolutely.
If someone is struggling in an area and you can go over and help them with some way, this is about using manners. What a goal parents should have, and what a difference it would make in our culture.
Right. And parents, it does need to be modeled in the home. Do not expect that your teenager is going to show respect to your pastor or to his connect group leader or whatever if you do not show respect. If you're talking behind someone's back in the home, or if you leave church and you're like, oh, I cannot stand whatever blank you fill in the blank, of whatever you don't like about the service. And then you wonder why your teenager walks past your pastor and won't shake his hand and show him respect. Well, it may be because it's not being modeled.
Sure. And here's one last one. Some must-have goals in training our children: respond when addressed, obey well, use manners.
Yes.
And then number 4 kind of goes with manners, but we put it separately on purpose: develop gratitude.
Yes.
You want your child to have a grateful heart.
Yes.
Remind them all the time that gratitude is important. To say thank you
Absolutely.
for meals, thank you for clothing, thank you for a
Yes.
sermon. To say thank you to the person that sang a song at church. To say thank you when someone does something for you.
Yes.
Manners is a matter of saying and showing. It's not just a
Yes.
matter of like, okay, thanks. No, it's a matter of showing it, your facial expressions, your heart.
Right.
And one of the great lacks in our culture is gratitude.
Absolutely.
And the more we can train our children to have grateful hearts, to say it and to show it, the more successful our children will be.
Yes, and they're happier when they are
Yes.
grateful. Grateful people are happy people.
Absolutely, every time. And so work at this, work at this, work at this. So just some must-have goals today in training our children.
Yes.
Any final thought or any other goal that
I
came
think
to
we
your
can
mind?
continue next week.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today here at the Keeping It Young podcast. It's always important that we hear from you. We occasionally pause for question and answer podcasts, and we'd love to hear some questions that you have that we can answer online. So please reach out to us with those. You can reach out to us on social media via our website at thekeepingityoungpodcast.com.
Right.
The easiest way on the podcast website is with the microphone in the lower right-hand corner, or you can go to my personal website, evangelistdaveyoung.com. But either way, we'd love to hear from you. And so reach out to us if we can help you, be a blessing. If you have a story, if we remind you of a story in your family, we would love to hear about that story. That's always
Yes.
encouraging and a blessing. All right, any final word?
Not today. I don't
Okay.
think so.
Well, have a good rest of the day. And remember this week to serve the Lord with gladness.
The Keeping It Young podcast is a Bax 5 media production.